All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining the certificate request webinar or web seminar from Twocanoes Software. I'm Timothy Perfit, and I'm going to spend about 30 minutes going through the features as well as showing a nice demo and answering questions that you have. Before we get started, you can use the chat ability inside of the Zoom web seminar to send me any questions. So you can see that in the interface, just choose chat, and then you can type a message and it'll just be sent to me. I'll be the only one that will see it, and then I'll be able to answer any of your questions. Also give some contact information. If you have any questions there, we can arrange a phone call, or you can shoot an email to us. We can do our best to answer it. The seminar usually runs from 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how many questions that we get. So that's kind of the logistics. So let's go ahead and get started and talking about certificate requests. So first question is, what is it? So it's an macOS app and a command line tool that's embedded inside the app for 10.12 and 10.13. And it allows you to request digital certificates directly from Active Directory. You can do this either unbound or bound, and you can request either user certificates or computer certificates. And I will explain kind of how to go about doing that as we get into it. So that's from a high level. It's really something that you install to allow you to request certificates or identities from your Microsoft Certificate Authority. So the question is, if you have, in order for this to be useful, you have to have a Microsoft CA or Certificate Authority, and you also have to have a Mac. And if you have those two things and you need certificates to configure services, then certificate request is for you. So the kind of what the end use is for these digital certificates, macOS in a lot of environments, especially enterprise environments, requires digital certificates to be able to configure services as either primary or as a second factor for authentication. So examples of this: mail can require a certificate, VPN is a very common one, and probably the most common of them all is 802.1x or wireless. So there's a lot of wireless environments that require a digital certificate from Active Directory to be able to join their wireless. And so this allows it a great way for the Mac to be able to get that certificate and then start participating in the Wi-Fi authentication process. So before we get started, let's just talk the basics of what a digital certificate is. This isn't a class on PKI, but it is good to have a kind of a common understanding of what certificate request does with digital certificates and what they are. So digital certificates is another name for them is X509 digital certificates. Wikipedia defines it as an electronic document used to prove ownership of a public key. So you have to have both a public key and a private key. The private key, the way that certificate request works and the way that's very common to do generation and certificate requests is that the local machine will generate a private key and a public key and generate a signing request that only shares the public key and the information that it wants, in the certificate for the service, and sends that to Active Directory. Active Directory then makes sure that the user is authenticated, will sign it with the signature of the certificate authority, and then send it back. So the big key thing of this is the private key is kept private. It's not generated by the certificate authority. It is not sent to the certificate authority. It stays in the keychain or on the YubiKey, depending on which method you're using. I haven't talked about YubiKey yet, but that's a hardware device that allows you to store your certificates and keys on this hardware device. And we'll get more into that in a minute. So, but the important thing, especially certificate request, is the keys are generated in the keychain. The private key is never shared outside the keychain, and so it remains secure on the device. So once the certificate authority receives the certificate request, it then sends it back, and certificate request will be able to inject that or import it into the keychain, and the keychain automatically matches it up with the private key, and then you have what's called an identity, which is the certificate and the private key. So that's kind of a basic overview of what a digital certificate is. So why do you even need the application, right? So if you have an environment that you need to access Active Directory services, so things like Wi-Fi, you might be using remote access services to manage your Wi-Fi. You might have an Exchange server that requires a certificate. So you have things by Active Directory that the certificates are issued by Active Directory, and it requires the client to use a certificate to authenticate. It also, you could also just generate it on the certificate authority, but that's very manually intensive, and it also exposes the private key. So using certificate request is a great way to be able to kind of a secure way to generate a certificate request. And the other kind of really interesting piece to all this is that there's lots of different ways to do this, but it doesn't require any changes to the AD infrastructure. Mainly, it does not require you to turn on the WebCA. So the Microsoft Certificate Authority has a way to submit a request to a web interface, but most environments do not have the WebCA turned on. And so certificate request doesn't require that. In fact, it doesn't even use it. It uses the services that are exposed by Active Directory for any PC. So mainly Kerberos, LDAP, and DCE RPC, which is a common way for Windows machines to access Windows services. So there is other ways, like I mentioned, there is other ways to go about doing this, but you don't have to turn on a proxy. So there's a lot of ways to proxy this, and no need to turn on the WebCA. There is environments that allow proxying, but a lot of times the proxying will require you to either give too much access to the proxy, where you basically delegate your authority to issue certificates to this proxy, which a lot of administrators are not comfortable with for good reason. And WebCA could potentially open up vulnerabilities depending on where you're exposing the WebCA, but either way, it makes it very difficult to script or to automate. So one of the nice things about certificate request is it's a very easy way to have the user generate a certificate request on their own, or you can automate it with the command line tool with your client management system. So that's really what the heart of what certificate request does. You can use it with or without Active Directory binding. If there's a lot of environments that are moving away from Active Directory binding but still need to access these services. My machine that I'm doing a demo on is not bound to Active Directory, but I'm still able to get Kerberos tickets. I'm still able to do certificate requests. I can either get a user certificate or a computer certificate, and I'll show a demo of that in a minute. The most common templates, well, let me back up. So Microsoft Certificate Authority has collections of settings for certificates organized into things called templates. And the two most common one is a user template, which has a collection of things like the username, the UPN, a user profile name in Active Directory. You might have the email address of the user. The collection for a computer the template is called machine, and that has things like the UPN, but it doesn't have an email because it makes any sense to have an email for a computer. So Active Directory has the idea of templates that is a collection of users or a collection of settings. Certificate request will be able to download all the template names and be able to have you easily select them. So it removes that user error problem of not knowing the template name. They can just choose it from a list. It also will discover a whole bunch of other settings that normally would be difficult for the user to understand and discover, or even for administrator, this will allow them to kind of easily discover it. There is a command line utility that if you install the certificate request app on each machine, you can then call that command line utility from inside the app, and it will basically do that same operation, but without requiring any use in the UI. So a great way to script it from a command line utility. So here's the main interface. Let me just go through it briefly. I'll show this. Well, let me wait for the demo, and I'll go through the individual pieces. But the kind of key piece is that it automatically discovers a lot of the information, or all the information that you would need. So let me talk a little bit in depth. Well, before I even do that, let me jump in and show you a demo. So I think before I kind of explain exactly how it works, it's really cool to see it working. So let me stop sharing my presentation and share my full screen. And I'll hide the presentation and close all these windows. So what I have up here, hopefully you're seeing, is the actual certificate authority. I have a Microsoft Remote Desktop into our Active Directory certificate authority. And you can see these are all of these certificates that I have requested. You can see it's important to see, because I've been doing a lot of testing, the last number is 45. So I've issued this request. You can see that this is where you manage That's issued certificates. There's ones that are failed as well as pending. But we'll just be looking under issued requests. You can see the last one is 45. Okay, so let me open up certificate request. And I was doing some testing. Let me destroy my credentials and kind of get back to the very beginning. And the first thing I want to do is authenticate. So I'll go up when you first launch it. Let me launch it again. I had it authenticated. It prompts you for credentials. If you're bound to Active Directory, it won't prompt you. It'll just use those credentials. But since I'm not bound, I don't have kerberos tickets, I'll type in my username with my domain. My domain is twocanoes.com. Username is tperfect, and I'll put in my Active Directory password. And you can see the first thing it did is it got the credentials, it went out and it discovered what the root certificate is for the certificate authority. It figured out what the DNS name of the CA, the certificate authority, is. It got the name of it, which is important that you have to specify in the request. Downloaded all of the templates that are available off the certificate authority, and it also filled in the common name, which you're going to use. You could change this, but this is almost always the same from the credentials. So that's information that's been discovered. One of the neat features here is if you click on the root certificate, you can actually look at the root certificate and then trust it. And I won't trust it quite yet because I want to show you what it looks like untrusted. And then, no, I don't want to do that. Untrusted, then I'll trust it and you can see the change. So it's a great way to install the root certificate and discover which one that we're using. On the bottom here, we have where is it actually the request generated from, or the key pairs generated. And for us, we're going to use the keychain in macOS, but we also support YubiKey. So if you're familiar with YubiKey, it's a hardware device that allows you to store your credentials. It does use the YubiKey's APIs, so everything's generated on the device. The private key is never exposed. And you have to put the slot and the management key in here that you get when you set up the YubiKey. Not really going to be covering that unless there's any specific questions around it. We'll stick with the keychain. So let me open up Keychain Access on the Mac. And Keychain Access is a place that all of your certificates and passwords are stored. You can see that I'm in my login keychain, and under my certificates, these are all my identities that I have installed. I believe I removed all of them. Oh, I didn't remove this one. So this is another test I did. So I'll remove all the identities I have related to this, and hopefully you'll see the one appeared up here. So we'll move this over and go back to certificate request. And what I'll do is I will just simply, because it filled in all the information for me, I just do request and install certificate. So once I've done that, it goes out, makes a certificate request, and does it, and it's all done. So I look in my keychain, I can see here's my certificate. It's not trusted. Here's the issue I was talking about, because it's not a certificate that's issued from a known certificate authority. So I'll have to trust it. But you can see here's the certificate. It has my domain, all the information that's required. And now I can use this certificate for services. So if I go up and let's say I want to do 802.1x, actually I can't configure that here. If I wanted to go into mail or one of the other services, that certificate would now be available to configure. So let's go back and get this trusted. So I go back to certificate request and I'll click on the root certificate, and because it doesn't know about the root, and I know it's a trusted source because I'm internal here, I will trust it. I'll give my local administrator password. And now I can see that if I click off, I'd have to click off it. And now it says this certificate is valid because it installed that root certificate. And now any certificates I install will now be trusted by this Mac. And the other thing is if we go in to the certificate authority, you can see that number 46 is now here. Ooh, I'm sorry. I actually didn't choose the, let me refresh this. Action, refresh. Right, so you can now see I have a user certificate that was issued, and it shows up, and it was issued associated with my account in Active Directory. So that's perfect. Didn't have to be bound. It got all the information it needed. So one of the other kind of nice things you can do is request a machine certificate. So if I destroy these credentials, and let me actually quit out of it. You don't have to do that, but it'll clear out the UI. And now I'm authenticating. If I wasn't authenticating, I can always go up to the Obtain Credentials menu. It's the same thing. And I will put in my machine name. and I'll put the domain name, and then I'll do the password. This is the one key to the computer account. You have to actually have a known password, which I just went into Active Directory and I just updated the password to something that's known. And I think I typed it wrong. I forget when that password is. All right, let me just reset the password. I have it right here. I'll change it to something that's known. Make sure I type it correctly. Okay, so it's changed. Now I will go back to here and hopefully it's not allowing me to do this. Oh, it's MacBook Pro, not Mac Pro Book. That's what the problem was. I typed my computer name wrong. There we go. So now it just authenticated as the computer. Now instead of using the user template, I'll go down to the machine template. And I'll use that, and then I'll click Request and Install Certificate. It's now done. We can now go back to Active Directory, and if we look at the certificates under, we'll refresh this. You can see down here at the bottom, I now have a computer certificate that's under my MacBook Pro computer name. And if I look in the keychain, oops, not Keynote, keychain, I'll see a new MacBook Pro identity. Right here it is, and that's my identity. I actually have two of them because I did a test right before the webinar, so I'll get rid of that one. This one I just created. I actually can get rid of both of them, and we can see that when I request another one, it'll appear. Request and install, and there it goes. You should see it appear right here in MacBook Pro Twocanoes. And now this is a computer certificate. And you can use that to configure anything, which is very common as a Wi-Fi configuration to be able to configure and use Wi-Fi. So that's the ability to use certificate requests to request identities from Active Directory. So let me jump back into my presentation. 1 second. Oh, I just want to pause for a second here. A reminder that if you want to type any questions in the group chat, feel free to do that, and I'll be glad to answer them. All right, so let me stop sharing, and let me share my Keynote again. Interesting. If I had Keynote minimized, it did not allow me to select it as a sharing, but that's neither here nor there for this for certificate request. So let's talk now that we understand kind of what it does. Let me understand what goes on behind the scenes. So when you first authenticate and open up certificate request, if you already have an Active Directory or you already have Kerberos credentials from your Active Directory plugin or from a prior session, it'll just use those. If not, it'll prompt you. So when you first open up the app, it will discover information about the certificate authority. So using DNS, it'll do a service record lookup and figure out what your domain controller is, your nearest domain controllers. And it'll do an LDAP request using Kerberos to authenticate. And it'll use that to discover all the information that you get. And so once it shows that information and you select the correct one and you click the button, it will then submit the certificate signing request. You can see that here under Submit CSR. It submits the certificate signing request, and then when it's done, it will then receive back the signed certificate, and then it'll install that in the keychain. A lot of that stuff's done automatically. The command line tool has additional switches, so you can customize your environment. But if you have people in your environment that want to just self-configure services, the app running on OS 10 works really well. So let's look at the command line utility. You can see that inside, it's similar to what we did at the UI. The GUI, it doesn't discover stuff automatically for you, but you can see here it's TCS cert request. The -S flag allows you to specify what certificate of authority server. -C is the name of the certificate of authority, which either can be discovered or can just look it up in your certificate of authority. And then what template do you want to use? And it'll use your Kerberos credentials. So let me show a quick quick demo of that. Let me share my whole screen again. And open up the command line. Let me, well, I'll leave the certificate request up so I can get some values from it, which would be nice. And I'll make things a little bit bigger. There we go, so people can see it. And I'll leave keychain access up here as well. I'll delete this identity that I got before because I'll be generating ones that are similar to that. So first thing I want to do is I'll do a klist command, which will tell me, do I have any Kerberos credentials? I already authenticated through the GUI app to get the MacBook Pro credentials. That's fine. I already have those. That means I can run the command line tool right away. So I'll do applications, certificate request, contents, resources, TCS request, and the server name. I can do this, copy the server name. And then I want to provide the CA name. That's the CA's name. And also, what was the last option? Oh, the template. And this is where I currently have Kerberos credentials for machine, so I'll do the machine template. And since I already have the credentials, it's done. So I can just see is that I now have this MacBook Pro certificate inside the keychain. So let me go ahead and do a user one. So I'll do kdestroy to get rid of my Kerberos tickets. I'll do a klist. You can see there's no Kerberos credentials. And I'll do a kinit tperfect@twocanoes.com. And I'll put in my Active Directory credentials. And you can see I now have a Kerberos ticket for my user. And so I'll run that same command again. But instead of doing a machine, I want to do user. The certificate authority name doesn't change, and the server name of the certificate authority doesn't change as well. So I'll just hit return, and you can see it's saved, and now I have another identity. So I have 2 Timothy Perfects here. If I run it again, I can see I'll have 3. Done. So that's a great way you can just script this and send it out to the client management system to generate this, and then use it to configure your services that use it. So you can either do that through your MDM or be able to have a separate configuration for those services. So that's the command line tool to allow you to easily send a certificate request. There is some other, if you do, I believe it's -H with the command line tool, there's a full usage of the certificate. Oh, it's actually not /H. But anyways, it gave me usage. So you can specify multiple different things. If you already have a certificate signing request and you want to specify that manually, you can do that. Also, a common name that's usually generated. You can change the label that's in the keychain. We did the -S and -C. We can actually specify a different keychain if we want to store it. We can automate the YubiKey information. So if the user has a YubiKey, we can do that. Specify the template which we use, and verbose output. So there's a rich a number of command line options for this to be able to script it and be able to tie it to deploying new machines and configuring services on existing machines. So let me go back into our presentation. Oh, it's in my second screen. Here we go. Keynote. So that's a command line utility. So now when we go into service configuration, you can go into accounts and use those credentials. You can use VPN. Actually, VPN would be a good one to show. I'll show that in a second. And also 802.1x. This is all done through a profile, so you can't do it through the UI, but it means that it has a certificate available on the machine. So let me show you VPN. That's actually a really good demo. Share my full desktop, and we'll go into system preferences, network, add a new service for VPN. and we want somebody to use a key, so we'll do L2TP over IPsec, and we'll call this demo. Now when we go into configure it, we go in authentication settings, and we go to certificate. We now have the ones that we generated, and we should have the Timothy Perfect ones down here from the TCSC CA, which we do have. So now I select that, and I'm using my certificate. I also could, of course, choose a machine certificate if I wanted to, if that's what's required by your certificate authority. Oh, sorry, that's user authentication. Usually you have a password, and under machine, you would choose your machine certificate. So now I could VPN in something that's using Microsoft's remote access services that require a certificate from AD, and I wouldn't have to use a shared secret. I would have the certificate, and you as an administrator could revoke it anytime that you wanted to. So that's a really kind of a easy way for the user to do it without having to expose the credentials. And that's a big kind of key piece for certificate request, is you're never exposing that private key. So let me stop this, share it again for my keynote, and finish this up. So we have service configuration, show the demo. So some more information, if you want a trial, you can download it from our website. It's a full functioning 14-day trial. We do enterprise and education and tier pricing. So if you have a lot of machines, we can work a good way for you to easily deploy this. We do provide both premium and enterprise support. So just reach out to us if you go to the Twocanoes.com site, there's a link to click on support, and you'll go to our forums. You can also click on the bottom underneath. There's a contact us. If you put in there, send a message right to me, and I'll get back to you about scheduling a personal demo, or giving you a longer trial, or giving you a quote, or whatever you else want to do. We're happy to work with you. We also realize that a lot of Active Directory environments are different, and so it does require some configuration or some tweaking on our side, and we'd be more than happy to work with you if you have a complex Active Directory environment. So with that, I think I answered all the questions as I went through, but if there's any other questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box, and I'll be happy to answer them. I'm also going to post this webinar up on our YouTube channel, as well as a link that I'll put into our Twitter, Twocanoes Twitter feed, so you can follow us on Twitter to see that, or just reach out to us and I give you a link to it if you wanted to go back through this again, or share it out to other folks that are interested in your organization or certificate requests. But if you manage a lot of different Macs and you need to kind of solve the certificate problem, certificate request is a great way to do it. So get in touch, and I'll kind of work with you to get it working in your environment. Thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to talking with you. Bye now.